might not have existed in the past, or if it had, it wouldn't have been stored. Moreover, if the police executed a search warrant on your house looking for business documents, they wouldn't be able to take your family photo album or your medical records. But now all this information, transmitted and stored electronically, will be available with a single warrant. Because this bill and our surveillance laws largely assume that if the information exists electronically, that a warrant or production order should be enough to get it. Sure, we have some privacy, but when that's overcome by legal means, that privacy is totally gone. But interestingly, there is one exception. There is one form of communication that is considered to be beyond the reach of government agencies. And this exception is for legally privileged information, such as conversations with your lawyer. It's a good thing too, because legal privilege helps protect our rights to a fair trial. But once you have one exception, once you have recognised that preserving the integrity of our justice system might be more important than catching a particular criminal, isn't there room for more exceptions? Maybe we need to recognise that public health requires that people need to be honest with their doctors and exempt medical records. Maybe we need to recognise that people's sexuality and sexual activity should be able to be kept private. The New Zealand Bill of Rights says that everyone has the right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure. And this is normally taken to mean that there must be procedure and oversight to make sure a search isn't unreasonable. But I suggest there are whole classes of information that are never reasonable to access. But TICS says that the needs of law enforcement override privacy, health, human decency. TICS says that we should expect that our most private communications can be exposed at any time without us knowing. TICS says that if someone dares to create a system that law enforcement can't access, we'll fine them until they give in or forbid them from being sold in New Zealand. TICS says that the government's interest in making sure they can spy on us overrule any other considerations about how we build and manage the New Zealand internet and phone networks. We at Tech Liberty think that as the amount of information we store about ourselves online goes up and the nature of that information changes to become more personal, we need to think more carefully about who has the right to access that information and why. We think that our society might be better off if certain sorts of information aren't available to the government under any circumstances. We believe that we have the right to use appropriate and effective tools to protect our data online, not just from our own government, but also from anyone else in the world who might want to access it against our wishes. The laws we're passing here are all based on the thinking that the purpose of the government is to make things easy for law enforcement. We think we need to take a step back and start again, taking into account the New Zealand Bill of Rights and our right to privacy. Thank you.
Tonight's next speaker is an academic who has worked tirelessly in pointing out the madness of free trade deals. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Jane Kelsey.
Kia ora koutou. Tonight I want to talk about the madness of spying and secrecy. Some of you will have seen the great meeting we had in Auckland a few weeks ago on the GCSB Bill. And those of you who are here tonight, I think are a testament as well to the fact that people don't feel comfortable about what's happening in our country. And I think it's because it's a sense of affront to democracy. And for Māori, it's a sense of affront to tino rangatiratanga. And it's a sense that trust me doesn't work. And so I want to talk a little bit tonight about the connections between the GCSB Bill, the TICS Bill, and a particular campaign that a number of people I can see in the room here are working on, which is to expose what the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement would mean for us. And so one of the most fundamental links between those questions is about speaking truth to power. And speaking truth to power comes at a price. But that price should be protected by a democracy that recognises that our futures depend on our ability to be able to speak truth to power. The second of the links between the GCSB Bill, the TICS GCSB Act now, the TICS Bill, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is secrecy. We are moving into a domain where the executive exercises extraordinary power and where trust me dogma has now started to reassert itself. Now, there are many of us here, I can tell by the grey hairs like mine, who remember the Muldoon era. And that was a period of executive power, but it was largely one man exercising it. What we're facing now is a global systemic grab for power by an elite who are not prepared to hold themselves accountable and want to silence democracy. And that is a major threat, and it's why we have to connect the dots between the various kinds of challenges that we are confronted by. Some of the other links are a bit less obvious. The TICS Bill is the operational end of the GCSB Act, which was about legalising the GSB doing what the SIS and the police asked them to do in spying on New Zealanders. And it gives me absolutely no solace whatsoever that the police or the SIS need a warrant to do that. We know from the Urewera raids, and we will hear more about that from other speakers, how easily interception warrants were secured by the police, and that their actual surveillance went beyond those warrants, but they thought that was okay because it was common practice. The SIS warrants are even more scary than that because they're totally open-ended. The SIS Act defines security to mean the protection of New Zealand from activities within or relating to New Zealand that impact adversely on New Zealand's international well-being or economic well-being. Impacts adversely on the country's economic well-being. Now, that's an empty box into which you can put almost anything, especially if you're Tim Grosser. Now, that definition has been carried into the TICS Bill. So when they are, as telecommunications companies, facilitating the GCSB, which is facilitating the SIS and the police, it is in terms of that definition of security. Indeed, economic well-being was a specific reference in the Act until they realised it duplicated and they inserted it back into the definition of security. Now, let me give a practical sense of what that means in relation to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The government believes this agreement is in the national interest, but the negotiations are secret. So we can't know what they're doing, but they want to know what we're doing. They want to know where the leaked texts we got came from. They want to know through whom they came, even though they only had to be leaked because of their obsessive secrecy. They want to know which governments we're in touch with. They want to know what we're saying to those governments and how that affects their version of what's in New Zealand's interests. They want to know which negotiators or groups are asking for our assessment of what New Zealand is doing. Now, we're not doing anything illegal, right? What we are doing is to try and open up a debate that has been closed down by those who exercise executive prerogative. Now, John Key and Tim Grosser believe that our attempts to stop this agreement, at least until we have had an opportunity to see what they are proposing and assess what it means for us, impacts adversely on New Zealand's economic well-being. That means they could get an SIS warrant for what we're doing. Now, some of us are reasonably robust about this, but my concern is much more about the international dimension. The GCSB Act helps track our international activity with partners in a number of other countries. Some of those other countries are not tolerant of people who speak. They have internal security powers, some of them ban trade unions, some of them have no NGOs, and it is risky for people to simply ask the kinds of questions that we're asking. The GCSB will help track our communications, and the telcos will be instructed to facilitate that tracking, not only in New Zealand, but internationally. The TICS Bill says telcos must comply with that legislation here, but have to operate the same way offshore. So if you have transnational telcos, if you have Google and others operating here, according to our legislation, they have to be operating the same way everywhere else. That worries me about what my colleagues in other places are doing and what risks we are putting them at. The final link between the TPPA, the GCSB Act and the TICS Bill that I want to mention is actually about these big players. Google, Microsoft, Yahoo and others have spoken against the TICS Bill, which is really good. But I'm not sure whether it's a matter of business for them or a matter of principle. These same companies have admitted helping the National Security Agency to digitally eavesdrop through the PRISM project. But they have been equally unprincipled in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Their lobbying group, the Internet Association, wants the TPPA to set a single set of rules for a global digital information marketplace with no impediments or offline barriers. That is code word for no local variations and no local protections for civil liberties, for culture and for local values. A number of the chapters in the TPPA would be a direct assault on data protection and privacy protections that we need to be able to engage in effective democracy. And so what I want to say is we need to be concerned about the GCSB, we need to be concerned about the TICS legislation, but we need to understand the ramifications for this more broadly in our struggle to take back control of our lives and to determine the future of Aotearoa for future generations. Kia ora koutou.
If you are watching this at home right now on the live stream on the Daily Blog, we have a PayPal button there where you can donate money to the cause. We want to get this speaker tour to go through the country next year, and we also want to be able to put together an election campaign to make sure that we revoke the GCSB bill, and if this TICS bill goes through this week, we will also obviously want to revoke that as well. So if you are watching at home and you are able to donate, please do. Our next speaker, Kim.com, was going to come, but he unfortunately is very busy with his legal case as the government try to throw him out of the country. But we were very, very, very pleased that the CEO of Mega was so kind to be able to come along today. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Vikram Kumar.
Kia ora, good evening. I work for Mega, which will be a service provider under the TICS bill. Mega certainly perhaps better known for Kim.com. He's broken his leg and is at home in bed. I think he's promised to watch this and keep an eye on me over the live stream. So hi, Kim. We should also wave out to the GCSB and NSA who are no doubt looking in, which makes them strange bedfellows, I'd say. So I just wanted to first talk a little bit about privacy, because we've heard a lot about that term, and I don't think people really understand and fully appreciate what privacy is. I've got no problem with people who say that they have nothing to fear or hide, therefore they've got no problems with these bills. That's okay. But you and I, as human beings, we have the right to privacy. We don't have to ask for it. We don't have to demand for it. It's our right as human beings. We don't have to justify to anyone when we ask for privacy. On the contrary, those who take away our privacy or those who want to lawfully limit it need to justify to us why those limitations are necessary, proportionate, and effective. It isn't only about the GCSB. We've now moved on. The GCSB bill has been passed. The TICS Bill is far wider. It talks about not only the GCSB, but SIS, Defence Force, Police, Customs, Internal Affairs, and anyone else the government wants to add to that list. In fact, it might be easier for the government to just tell us who can't spy on us. Let's get that list out instead. So if you look at privacy, we should expect privacy online as we do in our lives every day. It's really hard for anyone to be anonymous online. And you've got to recognize that no matter what bill gets passed or what doesn't, our expectations of what happens online need to be realistic. And the realistic expectation is privacy, which is control and consent over your own data and your own information. It is very, very hard to be anonymous online. And those who need anonymity, there are good reasons. Jane mentioned some of them, Thomas mentioned some of them, but it's very hard to get anonymous services from business services. So we just have to be careful about what our expectations are, and we have to be clear of when we ask for privacy, what we're asking for. Now, one of the reasons that when the government asked for submissions, I asked in an Official Information Act request for more information because I knew that the Prime Minister, the ministers, government officials would turn around and say, this is all misinformed speculation. If you knew what I knew, you would accept that these bills are required. So I said, fine, tell me what you know. And I expected to get extremely redacted and limited information. And I did. But there was one thing that came out which surprised me, and it should surprise you, which is in every paper that's gone to Cabinet and is in Cabinet-approved policy documents, the government has made it clear that under the TICS Bill, it will issue secret orders, and it will gag service providers and network operators from talking about what orders have been put on them. That's unacceptable in a democratic society. What it means is that for businesses like Mega, we have to prove a negative. How do we prove to our customers and to people who care about this that we do not have an order from the government? Because, by definition, if we had, it may be secret. And so we are creating an environment in which everyone is untrusted. Because if you don't know who to trust, you trust no one. And New Zealand companies globally will now be used in the same breath as Chinese companies and American companies about backdoors. We are killing the ICT industry in New Zealand by these gag and secret orders. Secrecy has no place in this setup. And so I want to go beyond slightly to one more aspect, which is a lot of this is to do with the government. And the government has said, and we accept, that they should be held accountable. That it is you and I, when we exercise our democratic rights, to be able to tell the government whether we agree or not. And next year, in 2014, we will take that opportunity. The question is, should we do nothing till that time? The answer is no. Because what has happened is that over the last few years, there has been one sector which has become complicit with the government in spying on us. And that sector, without their cooperation, the government cannot spy on us. And that's the telcos. Understand that the Privacy Act, Principle 11, gives an exception where a telco is allowed to provide personal information to lawful requests because they can cover themselves. But it doesn't have to be that way. Google, Microsoft, Facebook have been forced by their customers to plead their respective governments to turn that around because it's business. So you and I, we don't have to wait till next year. We can go, it's inconvenient, but if you truly believe that we have to show our muscle and our difference, you and I are paying telcos to spy on us. All we have to do is to tell our telecommunication provider, our ISP, stop it. Yes, you have to comply, but you don't have to be complicit. Yes, you have to give information when you are required to do so. But no, you do not have to give my personal information when you are simply requested to do so. We can put a stop to this. Our money power, we don't have to wait to 2014 to hold the government accountable. You and I can start holding the telecommunication industry completely accountable. So let's just get beyond we're protesting or we disagree. Let's use our custom, our money, to move away from those telecommunication providers who are complicit with the government, who are unwilling to be transparent. Thank you.
Of course, tonight isn't just about companies that are facing huge costs just so that the government can spy on us. It's also about individuals. It's about your rights. It's about people who push the boundary, who get up, perform their democratic duty to question things and critique things, and they suddenly find the full weight of the government spying on them. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker knows those kind of pressures firsthand. Please welcome Valerie Morse.
Kia ora koutou, koutou mai nei I tēnei pō, e mihi ana, ki te tangata whenua o te rohi nei, te ati awa ki upoko, e mihi ana. Hi everyone, I don't actually want to talk to you about the Telecommunications Interception Capability and Security Bill, and I actually don't also want to talk to you about the Urawera case. There's other speakers here who can talk much more knowledgeably about the TICS Bill than I can. I want to talk to you about the cover story, the ruse that has been used to pass this law and its accessory, the GCSB Act. That ruse is national security. National security is the paradigm through which this law, and indeed many others in our time, have been passed. National security pits us against them, a picture of some nefarious forces outside of New Zealand, or maybe inside, but certainly not us, and constructs a set of laws in order to limit or mitigate what they can do to us. But who is the us being made more secure by all this national security? Well, the us certainly aren't Māori, who suffer state racism at the hands of the police and justice system, and who suffer daily prejudice in employment, housing, health, education, all sorts of areas of life at every turn. The us also aren't ordinary working people whose rights at work to fair pay, to join a union, to hold political views, to bargain collectively, are being erased by an agenda rolling back 150 years of workplace struggles, placing many families under extreme financial stress. The us also aren't beneficiaries, like the sick, invalid, unemployed, and single mothers who have been demonized by a punitive system that blames them for being poor. Their daily existence is subject to constant surveillance, harassment, and testing by the state. And the us definitely aren't the 88 New Zealanders or permanent residents who have been spied on by the GCSB and had their rights violated. So, who are the us in national security? Well, you might have guessed, there aren't any us. National security is a myth invented by those with power in society who use it as a cloak for their own economic and social interest. Under the guise of national security, their interests are presented as the interest of the majority of ordinary people, as simple common sense of what we all want. National security is really a state guarantee of the security of the rich and powerful in society to stay rich and powerful, to protect the continued concentration of their wealth and power. We would like to think New Zealand quite different than Russia, the so-called mafia state, or Mexico, the so-called narco state. But let us not delude ourselves too much. We have a corporate state here in Aotearoa in which all aspects of public policy are governed by multinational corporations. They don't need to kill us in order to shut us up. They've co-opted enough of us into a system using divide and rule tactics. Too many of us have turned a blind eye to the rampant injustices all around us. In our silence, we are complicit. But just in case, those who are currently protecting the national security plan to ensure our continued compliance by spying on each and every one of us. We've heard the opposition's cry for a review of the intelligence services. But the reality is, national security has enjoyed a very high degree of cross-party consensus for more than a decade, with almost all of the major political parties supporting a tough national security agenda and engagement in New Zealand's longest ever foreign war. The reality is that a review of the intelligence services is totally inadequate. We need a whole new paradigm in which to understand security in our time. What might that national security look like? Well, here's just a couple of ideas. For me, first and foremost, a secure society is one in which the Indigenous people are at the centre, not at the margins. This is Māori land, and we can only be secure when we accept that as the legitimate starting point for our society. It follows that security would also be the ability of all people to meet their basic needs for food, clothing, housing, health, and education without stress or worry. Real security would be the absence of fear by women, just like me, who were no longer being raped, assaulted, and murdered, mostly by their partners. Security would be severely reducing our carbon emissions and our dependence on fossil fuels, ensuring our collective survival. Security would be the fiercest protections of our fundamental freedoms to life, speech, movement, and, of course, privacy. This isn't a political platform. In fact, if anything, I think we need a whole lot less politics and a whole lot more participatory democracy, community action, and a sustained change in our cultural values in Aotearoa. In the past few months, I've been deeply heartened by so many people are outraged at the actions of the state in legalizing mass, suspicionless surveillance. It is ordinary people who have made this an issue, not the politicians, and we can't stop now. We need to trust the government less, a lot less, and we need to make it impossible for those who hold power, regardless of the color of their jerseys, to ignore our demands any longer. These laws must go, and along with them, the military and intelligence alliances that have spawned these agencies and their paranoid worldview. We need to start creating the kind of world we want to live in. It's going to take our courage. It's going to take our time. For those of us who are Pākehā, it will take our humility. But we have nothing to lose but the chains of global corporate control and the spying eyes of the surveillance state. Kia ora.
Those trying to operate businesses, of course, under this new legislation are just screwed. Ladies and gentlemen, to talk about that, entrepreneur Seeby Woodhouse.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. On the billing, I was billed as the founder of Orcon, which is true. But I did sell Orcon a few years ago, and it's probably more accurate to say that I'm currently the founder and owner of Voyager, which is one of the telcos that will be subject to the Telecommunications Interception Bill. So while I can talk to you tonight about some of the implications of that, I may soon not be allowed to talk to you at all, so I want to take the opportunity to do so while I'm not subject to a gag order. As some of you may know, I spoke about a month ago in Auckland against the GCSB Bill, and I didn't do that to win any political points. Obviously, I'm not a politician. I didn't do it for any financial gain. In fact, I'm almost certain that there has been, cost to myself financially for speaking out against the GCSB Bill. I did it as a concerned citizen because I believe that the GCSB, TICS and TPPA bills are fundamentally wrong, and they're an affront to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And after I read them, I was pretty shocked. So I spoke out. I did my part, and I didn't believe that it would have any effect to my life. In fact, I joked to my fiance after the GCSB meeting, I suppose I'll be on some, tree-hugging kind of list now or something like that, and, we'll see what happens. So I was surprised and alarmed, but I don't want to make an accusation here. Only a few days after I spoke out at the GCSB, I went to America, and one of the purposes was to attend a friend's wedding. The other purpose was to go to the America's Cup and, as you do, have a winter holiday. Upon landing in America, I was pulled aside and interviewed about my intentions for being in the US. That's something that's never happened before in 15 years of travel. I've been in the US 8 times this year alone, and I would like to say I'm not accusing the government of putting me on some sort of list, but I do find it, kind of coincidental. And on the way back into New Zealand again, I was pulled aside and subject to a reasonably long interrogation. It was very polite. I wasn't searched. But I did get a shiver down my spine when the person started asking me why I had booked a private flight in Toulouse in France on a different credit card from the one that I was normally on, and why I had, why my passport had recently expired, and all of these kind of little facts about my holiday that I kind of figured would be hard to piece together. Now, again, I don't want to imply that I am accusing the government of putting me on some sort of list, although that may be, well, what has happened. What I would like to point out is that it's the fear of that is enough. The fear of that is enough to make me concerned and doubt whether I should be potentially here tonight. And the issue is that the way that these bills are being enacted, the way that they are being put forward with so much secrecy, sorry, the public's not allowed to know about this, not allowed to know about this, we know your best interests, we're not going to tell you what's going on. The secrecy is the damage. It's probably unlikely that John Key or whoever is going to be going through your emails at night and reading about the fact that you sent a pastry recipe to your grandma or something like that. But if everyone starts worrying about that, then it's going to make a real difference. And effectively, that's living in a fascist state. A big part of the problem is that it's not just freedom of speech that we're fighting for here. The internet is an extension of our brains. It's actually freedom of thought. It's one level above freedom of speech, and that's something a lot of people haven't considered. Google is almost an extension of our brains these days, and just because you think something doesn't make it a criminal offence. One of the most damaging things is that, if I get pulled up every time I go overseas, I probably will have a good inkling of why that is. I'm now some sort of subversive person, and that will give me some sort of comfort. But imagine if you start getting pulled up every time you go overseas and you have no idea whatsoever. Let us consider a hypothetical, person, and the government says, well, this person has, searched for how to make methamphetamine a couple of times. Well, reasonably, a lot of you in the crowd might think, well, that's fair enough, and okay, we'll take that information, and yes, we should search their bags, we should search every time in New Zealand. That's a reasonable deduction. But what if that person happened to be a university professor trying to understand the symptoms and that kind of thing? There are a lot of unintended consequences, and when these things are kept secret, you may not know why you've been profiled, you may not know why you've been put into this list, and that's extraordinarily damaging. Another thing that I don't think is really been talked about is we're all concerned about the erosion of privacy. We're all concerned about the GCSB and TICS impinging on our rights, our privacy, and as we should be. But what about the financial cost? If you imagine the smallest telephone company in the world, 2 kids with the paper cups and the string and that kind of thing, well, your cost of running that telecommunications enterprise is pretty small. You've only got 2 paper cups, a piece of string, 2 people talking to each other. But imagine if you suddenly say, well, we want to be able to archive all the conversations. We want to be able to intercept all the conversations. We want a text-interpreted, text-to-speech record of all of those things that have gone on. All of a sudden, you have to cut the piece of string. You have to hide the fact that you've done it. You have to put things in the middle. And all of a sudden, it becomes this huge thing. So the infrastructure required, not just to intercept all of our telecommunications, is going to be financially huge. and the storage required. Recently there was one of the people in the CIA let slip that in the Boston bombings, they didn't know obviously it was going to happen, but the CIA has gone back and listened to the voice recordings years prior of the people involved in the Boston bombings, because they could then go and dig out those conversations. So, if one day in the future all of a sudden a new government decides that you are doing something subversive, it's not just current conversations, it's not just prior things, it's actually all of your recordings going back. Now, we know in New Zealand that we could be a lot more competitive if we had another subsea cable, and I would be willing to bet money that we could afford to pay for another subsea cable so that we weren't on a monopoly on the Southern Cross cable. This $1.5 billion that we've spent on rolling out the UFB network, imagine if we had 2 subsea cables for the US, the price of bandwidth would be halved, would be a lot more productive. And I would bet that the cost of a new subsea cable would be less than the cost to us of implementing TICS and GSB and all that kind of thing. So the financial costs are completely hidden, and I don't think that they should be. Just want to say a couple more things, if that's all right. I'll try and... I've sort of talked a couple of little things about the cost, but the other thing is the huge, benefits that we're giving up. So tens of billions of dollars have been wiped off the market caps of US cloud providers as these revelations have come to light. And the reason for that is that overseas people, including myself, have said, well, I don't want to store files in Dropbox or Facebook or this, so I'm going to use local file storage companies like mega.co.nz. I'm going to pull that data back, and that means less money for those US companies. Now, that's a huge opportunity, for New Zealand. Right back to Helen Clark talking about the knowledge wave economy. She set up the framework for New Zealand to be an innovation leader. So if we had 2 subsea cables and we had a framework of transparency where we could impart these laws, but it was transparent what we're doing, we had the respect of the international community, then those cloud providers could relocate here. Already a couple of the private email providers in the US with market caps of tens of millions of dollars voluntarily shut down because they were going to be intercepted by the US government. Imagine if we said, hey, just set up shop in New Zealand, we will support you. You have a legitimate business, and if any terrorists are harbouring on there, we'll get a warrant, it'll be transparent. So, a lot of this stuff is not transparent. And I think that's the key thing. I personally disagree with the laws full stop, but if they're going to be enacted, we need to make some very serious wholesale changes so that the public has information on the number of requests, what's happening, who it's happening to, and then this fear won't happen. And you can't fight fear with fear. We're being wholesale sold terrorism, this is why it's happening, all that kind of thing. That's an attitude of fear. We need to come from a place of love. Thank you.
When Seeby Woodhouse is considered the enemy, ladies and gentlemen, things have gone way, way off the reserve here. This is outrageous. Seeby Woodhouse is like the Dave Dobbin of entrepreneurs. He's set up bloody Orcon. He runs Voyager, which the Daily Blog works on and is wonderful. Thank you so much. When he's getting questioned because he stands up and says, hey, you know what, this is kind of shit. Shouldn't we be doing something about this? When he's perceived as the enemy, that's outrageous. This is something that has to be stopped. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is the Vice President of Mana. She will be the next MP for Wairiki. Please put your hands together for Annette Sykes.
Kia ora te whare, te tino ātāhu o tō tātou nei whare karakira. I tū mai nei, hei manaki a tātou i tēnei pō. Koutou i tai mai ki te whakarongo i tēnei kaupapa whakahirihira tēnā koutou katoa. Koutou ngā tāngata whenua o te whanganui a taranei tēnā koutou katoa. I just have to actually admire this house that we're in tonight. It's an absolutely, indictment that we hear, a sad indictment, because it reminds me actually of the wharekira karakia at Rangiauhia. And for Māori, that was one of the first places where spies came in and caused huge disruption to our communities. I don't know if you know of a chap called Reverend Volkner and a chap called Kereopa, but I was the lawyer for the claims of the people of Waimana. And Volkner was ultimately hanged and Kereopa was accused of that hanging in Opotiki some several years after the burning of Rangiahia, where a number of Māori women and children of the peoples of Ngāti Maniapoto had been seeking solace. That story is quite well known in the history that is taught in our schools, but what is not known is that at the time that this heinous event occurred, Kereopa was actually a policeman acting for the New Zealand constabulary at the period. His children and his wife was burnt in the church, and it was said bayoneted by soldiers. It completely turned the man madness, and the spy that actually was responsible for both leading the soldiers to that church, he always claimed was Volkner. So the act of Utu ultimately meant that in Opotiki 2 years later, after being hunted down by Kereopa, Volkner was hung from a tree. It is that kind of conflict that can arise from unjust acts of spying and surveillance. It is that kind of conflict that I wish to address tonight. But the irony of it coming into this church today, which is a beautiful place, it's a place of peace. It's a place where we come together to seek justice. It's a place where the walls listen and tell stories of tales of the kind that I've talked about with a sense of trying to find reconciliation and redemption. So whoever decided that we should be here tonight, thank you. But again, let's remember the past if we're actually going to move forward as a nation to change the future, to find a sense of justice for us all. The first thing I want to do is to thank the organisers who have promoted informed debate and critique on the legislation that we're examining and the underlying rejection of the false consciousness that the Prime Minister John Key and his cabinet colleagues have promoted over the past few months. As this piece of legislation, as part of a trilogy of legislation, has been crafted to meet their intentions to give wholesale spying powers to our intelligence agencies and their ability to collaborate and co-opt the private sector to facilitate their ends. It is what I call the sledgehammer principle. You know, trust me, I know what I'm doing, school of thought, that has not so subtly underpinned their press releases and their efforts to scaremonger and then persuade the public that a sense of urgency is required in the name of national security, such that we can risk the erosion of fundamental freedoms that we as a nation have long fought to protect and pass this legislation in haste, without question, without examination, by us, the people. It is also with a sense of pride that I stand with those who have been invited to speak to this gathering. I haven't seen Valerie Morse since the sentencing of the Urewera 4. She has been an inspiration to me as a solicitor at the bar, but as a woman who fights against injustice. I see Jane Kelsey and John Minto a lot more regularly, and I've seen David Cunliffe in recent times on television, and I must admire some of the public statements coming from him. So it's with a sense of pride that I stand today with people who have clearly got a track record against injustice. They have dared tonight to invest time to convince people individually and those in that institution down the road perhaps to listen, that there are alternatives, that those alternatives are worth fighting for. A group, many of whom are recalled in the nation's memory as freedom fighters, but unfortunately are still regarded by some of our nation's leaders as haters and wreckers, as Māori activists are oft described. Some of whom have been at the forefront of change to ensure fundamental rights are protected, to ensure that the excesses of state power, be it in cases around the legality of search warrants or in the aftermath of an organised protest for workers' rights, Māori land rights, anti-racism marches, have stood up for suspected breaches of human rights and have fought for the rights of those whose individual and collective freedoms have been breached. Many like me who have been denied their SIS files and are certain to be part of the 85 individuals who have been unlawfully watched by our spy agencies, but who will be denied watching the state test the legality of the breaches of the etiquette with respect to search warrants and their extent in the courts of this land, because the police themselves, who self-police all of these agencies, have determined that despite such carte blanche disregard for the law, those kind of individuals will not be prosecuted because their motives were bona fide and in the nation's national interest. Our message this evening is clear. Mr. Key and those that have foolishly pledged to support you, we don't trust you. And we know you don't know what you are doing. Simply because if you did, you would not do it. Furthermore, there are many questions to be asked of our surveillance agencies that need to be done in an accountable and transparent manner. If we are to give credence to the fact that no one is above the law and that all law in this land should be applied equally, without fear or favour or regard to racial persuasion. I wanted to focus my discussion to a couple of instances, but the TICS legislation has to be seen as part of a trilogy, and I wanted to look to the past to highlight it. In the Urewera case, where I represented the 15 that were ultimately found to have been arrested unlawfully and found to have been detained inappropriately and had their charges dismissed by the Supreme Court, the Telecom and Vodafone agents were very complicit in the ultimate gathering of information for them and a number of the innocents. Despite decisions like that, those groups of individuals are still labelled as terrorists by misinformed public and the media. They carry those labels, like Kiriopa, as people that are savages, that are uncivilised, that do not merit the safety and protection of the law. I'm really glad that I'm here this evening to be with you. I know like-minded individuals like us who do not accept that. And I want to draw on the discourse of Hone Harawira when he raised these matters in Auckland, because he said them in a very simple way. We are here tonight to stand united in opposition to the GCSB Act and to the TICS Bill. But that opposition must extend more than just repealing those acts. It must embrace what Valerie Morse has said tonight. It must embrace the Treaty of Waitangi as a liberating force for ensuring that the fundamental freedoms that this land is built on is protected as we move forward as a nation. I have confidence that those behind me and those who stand with me will fight to repeal this legislation. But the tyranny of the majority of one that has enabled this legislation to occur must be challenged by all of us. Kia ora.
Gosh, she needs to be in Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are watching this at home on the live stream, again, we have a small PayPal button you can click if you are in a position to donate. We want to take this speaker tour around the country next year, and in the lead up to the election, we want to make sure this is on the political agenda so this bloody legislation gets revoked. To come and speak to some of those points, he's actually the Mana candidate in the Auckland mayoralty at the moment. I don't think he's going to get many votes here in Wellington, but if you're able to vote, please do, and do often. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome John Minto.
Te whare karakia ki tūnei, tēnā koe, ngā tangata whenua o tēnei rohi, kia ora koutou, e ngā hoi whā, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Greetings, everybody. I felt an absolute idiot last year when the Prime Minister announced that the GCSB had been spying on New Zealanders, because I believed the GCSB when they said they didn't spy on New Zealanders, because we already had the police and the SIS who spied on New Zealanders. The GCSB said their job was foreign intelligence. I believed them. And then when it was announced that they were spying on New Zealanders, I thought, my God, the conspiracy theorists are right. And I was wrong. I felt an absolute dick. And I'm not going to be caught out again. None of us should be caught out again when we hear what these people say. We should never believe what they say. We should always take them at our experience of their behaviour, which has been appalling. So what I want to do is bring the debate back tonight to the most important role of GCSB, which is as part of the Global Five Eyes network. And that's the nickname for the UK-USA agreement, which was signed after the Second World War by the UK, the USA, New Zealand, Australia and Canada, those 5 countries. And they are the Five Eyes. And they decided to form an international, a global surveillance network. And New Zealand was part of that. And as a result of that, the Tangi Moana spy base near Palmerston North was set up in the early 1980s. And then in the late 1980s, the Waihopai spy base was set up near near Blenheim. And this network involves these 5 countries, but by far the dominant partner is the National Security Agency, which is the US version of the GCSB. Right? So the NSA is by far the dominant group or dominant partner in this intelligence network. And I wanted just to illustrate 2 things about the GCSB, which are on the public record. That, as I said before, Waihopai was established in the late 1980s, and Dave Longy was the Prime Minister. And Dave Longy was asked by Nikki Hager to write a foreword to his book, Secret Power, in 1996, right? And when Dave Longy wrote that foreword, he said in his foreword, it wasn't until I read Nikki Hager's book that I had any clear idea on what the GCSB was doing. Now, if you think about that for a moment, this was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, this was the Minister of Security and Intelligence in New Zealand, not being given information, basic information about what the Waihopai spy base was doing and what the GCSB was doing. And I think what it tells us is that the GCSB sees its first allegiance to the US, rather than its first allegiance being to the democratically elected government of New Zealand. And that's got to be an extreme concern to us. Secondly, the other example I want to give is also well on the public record, and that was the time in 2003 when the United States was trying to get the UN Security Council to pass a resolution to justify an invasion of Iraq. And what the NSA did, that's the US organisation, they sent an email out around the Five Eyes network, and they said, we want you to spy on the members of the United Nations Security Council, and they mentioned Angola, Cameroon, Chile, Bulgaria and Guinea, those 5 countries in particular, because they wanted information to leverage those countries into supporting a UN resolution. So here we have the New Zealand government saying, we're not going to be part of this invasion of Iraq, but behind their backs we've got the GCSB working really hard on behalf of the US to get information to help the US prosecute an invasion of Iraq. And I think we can be thankful for the woman who leaked that, one of those courageous whistleblowers, Catherine Gunn. She leaked that email in an attempt to stop a war. And in a sane world, she may well have succeeded, but she didn't. But she did that at great personal risk, and I think we should also tonight remember those other people like Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden, who at great personal risk also have brought information out to the public that we deserve to know. So kia ora to those people. If the message from this meeting can get out to any of those 3, I think that's great. Edward Snowden's whistleblowing has lifted the lid, and the NSA spying it's far more comprehensive and far more intrusive than most of us imagined. And it involves the wholesale collection of data, not just metadata, as our Prime Minister tried to say. And it involves storing that data for retrospective spying on everything we do or have done. And I say we because it's not just US citizens, but all of us here in New Zealand who are in the NSA's sights. So when the Edward Snowden's whistleblowing became public knowledge in the US officials have been running around trying to justify it. And what they've said is that if you want to search to find a needle in a haystack, then you have to be able to search the whole haystack. And the GCSB's role is to provide the New Zealand and the South Pacific part of that haystack for the NSA to search. And the crucial point here is that the GCSB requires a warrant to spy on New Zealanders, in theory anyway, but the National Security Agency doesn't. And under the GCSB role to cooperate with our foreign intelligence partners, the GCSB gives the NSA access to all of our information. Not for the GCSB to spy directly, because they need a warrant to do that, but for the NSA to spy as part of this haystack. There is nothing in this legislation, the GCSB Act or the TICS legislation, which would prevent the wholesale spying on New Zealanders as revealed by Edward Snowden. And if the Prime Minister was asked about this tomorrow, what he would say, he would refuse to comment on how we cooperate with our foreign partners, but he would say that he can assure us that the GCSB will follow the law, and if it wants to spy on New Zealanders, it will get a warrant to do so. In other words, he'll sidestep this whole issue. And in 10 years' time, we'll have a Prime Minister throw their hands up in horror at the mass surveillance that's been going on because somebody has leaked it. And then, if they follow John Key's lead, when the GCSB breaks the law or whatever, then you just change the law to legalise what they've done illegally. So the last point I want to make is that surveillance, this whole security apparatus, is not for the benefit of keeping New Zealand secure. It's actually about keeping the flow of intelligence from Waihopai to the US so it can pursue its global military and commercial objectives more easily. We don't need to have the GCSB at all. We've got the police and the SIS already with the ability to spy on New Zealanders. We should close down the GCSB because its loyalty is not to the people of New Zealand or our democratically elected governments. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
John, of course, is one of the people behind the Anti-GCSB coalition. I've worked very closely with him, getting these speeches and this talking tour around the country. He's a great man. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got two more speakers before we wind it up here tonight. He was amazing at the GCSB speech. Please put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen, for the co-leader of the Greens and hopefully a cabinet minister in the next government, Russel Norman.
Tēnā koutou, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here tonight, and congratulations to the organisers, both for the Auckland meeting and for tonight. I remember when the internet first happened, or at least happened to me. I mean, I didn't invent it like Al, but I remember when it happened in the 90s. And when the internet first happened, I was amazed by the internet and by digital communications. I was amazed about all the information I could access. All of a sudden, all the stuff that was really difficult. I remember at university trying to research for hours to find stuff, and you had search engines and all the rest of it. You could find incredible information. And it was also incredible all the different groups who didn't have a lot of resources who were able to effectively publish information and make it available to millions of other people as more and more and more people came online through the 90s. And I really believe that that was a fundamental moment of freedom for me. And I think it was a moment of freedom for millions of people as we entered this new world of digital communications, which seemed to me fundamentally different to the world that I'd come from, where it was so hard to find information. It was controlled by a small number of people. The media was all under the control of a small number of oligarchs like Rupert Murdoch. And all of a sudden, all these different groups could publish freely, and I could access all that information. And it was a great and wonderful moment of freedom, and it defined my life, in a sense, that I came into this world and became an adult in this world. What I fear is that for the next generation, the people that come after me, for my children, is that this world of unlimited information and freedom will become a world of chains and state surveillance. So instead of seeing the world of digital communications as this fantastic place of all these resources that are available, all this essentially free communication that we can all do with each other now, instantaneously reaching millions of people, they'll see it as a place where you've got to be careful. You've got to be careful what you say, you've got to be careful who you talk to, you've got to be careful what you write down, because there's state surveillance which is recording all of it, all your emails, all of your activities online. And one day, if you put a foot wrong, they might research through their database and find it and use it against you. So what should be a moment of freedom, the discovery of the whole world of information and digital communication, will become instead slavery and bondage. And under the chains of the state, we will all live in a world of mass surveillance. It's only taken the state, a decade or so, a couple of decades maybe, to kind of catch up with the wonderful world of digital information and communication. But it is catching up. I also think when I was, even in 2001, when I was the organiser for a big rally about genetic engineering in Auckland, where there was 20,000 of us marching down the street, we had to do things like posters. I don't know if you're an organiser, if you remember posters. Remember, you had to print posters and then you had to get them put up, right? You had to print leaflets and you had to have thousands of people to distribute the bloody things, right? It was a huge effort. Being a progressive organiser, trying to change the world for the better and influence people and communicate ideas to people was difficult and expensive. And it took lots and lots and lots and lots of work. For that rally, we had to poster all over Auckland. It was a gigantic effort. And yet we had a public meeting in Auckland, massive public meeting in the Auckland Town Hall a month ago or so on exactly this issue, the GCSB, and we were able to do that all through online social media. It was fantastic. And that is the world that is threatened by the rise of the surveillance state in the world of digital communications. It means that the kind of freedom and horizontal communication, which is so liberating, which is a fantastic thing about being human in the early part of the 21st century, that we've suddenly got access to this incredible world of information and horizontal communication, is being put under threat. Because once you lose that kind of trust, the trust that you can freely communicate with other people, that you can access information without anyone coming at you later and saying, why did you go to that website? Why did you use your credit card in that particular way, as Seeby's quite amazing story post the public meeting? Why did you write that email to that person requesting more information? Because we've since discovered that that person has certain dubious connections. Once we lose the world where we feel free to access information, to have horizontal communication with other people all over the planet, this is a global phenomenon now, then we lose something that I believe is fundamentally very important about the world that we have discovered through the rise of digital communications. And my fear is that with this kind of bill, the TICS Bill, as well as the GCSB Bill, as well as what we've learned about what the US government is up to, hey, Dick Cheney morphs into Barack Obama, who would have picked that, as we discover what it is that they're actually doing, the worst of our worst conspiracy theories about what governments are up to in terms of establishing a mass surveillance state, it threatens something very important about these new freedoms that we've found. And it is up to us, as the people who are alive when this has been discovered, as the people who are conscious, the people who are here tonight, to speak out about it, to raise our voices about this issue and make sure that we protect those freedoms. That's why we're here tonight. That's what the Green Party's been doing in Parliament. Parliament for the last decade or so. That's why we voted against the stupid Terrorism Suppression Act. That's why we voted against the GCSB Act 2003 to begin with. That's why we'll vote against this stupid bill. And I tell you, it hasn't ended here. We will continue to fight for our freedoms. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more speaker this evening. Of course, anyone who's watching online who can donate, and kim.com, I'm looking at you. Please do. Ladies and gentlemen, he is the new leader of the Labour Party, and fingers crossed, he will be our next Prime Minister. Please welcome David Cunliffe.
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi mai. Well, today is my first day as Labour's spokesperson on security and intelligence. So it seems somehow appropriate to be here with you all thinking about how do we keep this apparatus under democratic, legitimate control. And yet, to speak with integrity, what I say to you tonight has to be good in a year's time. In a year's time, I hope that with your support, we will take the beehive back for our people. In a year's time, I wouldn't be surprised if my good colleague Russel Norman will also be part of that show, but that's for the voters to decide. In a year's time, I may well find myself the Minister of Security and Intelligence. So what can I say to you tonight that will hold integrity in being the same thing that I would say to you then? The Reverend Jim Veitch, a man who ordinarily I respect, said at the GCSB hearings words to the effect of, "The law needs to catch up with technology and practice." Wrong, Jim. So very wrong. The law must always be the outside edge of technology and practice. And that encapsulates the central question here, recognising the importance of freedom, recognising the importance of privacy, of liberty of association, of thought, of belief in a democratic society. What would a good government do? Is it wrong for a good government of the people to have the capability to protect its people from online or cyber threat? Possibly not. Probably not. Is it wrong for a good government to have the capability to intercept? Therefore, probably not. But as a minister previously, I've never forgotten that the only right that I would have to hold office is because the voters, the people, send us to Parliament. That Parliament which holds sovereignty under our Constitution makes the laws, thereby elects the Cabinet, sends the ministers to govern the departments, and the departments' actions, including those of the security agencies, only ever have legitimacy if they are subject to the rule of law and protect the rights and freedoms of citizens. And so it's perfectly possible that in seeking to protect those rights, the actions of a government could undermine the very thing that they set out to do. Well, how does that relate to this bill? And in thinking about it, I want to divide the issues into two types, which I would call, firstly, instrumental, and secondly, intrinsic. Instrumental because this bill effectively implements the issues that have already crossed our path in the case of the GCSB bill. And we've been very clear about that. We will immediately institute a full and independent inquiry. We will repeal that bill and we will replace it with something which conforms to proper democratic oversight. So let us recognise that the first weakness of this bill is that it seeks to implement a bill which is itself flawed, and those flaws must be fixed, and this legislation is therefore, one might say, tainted by those flaws. But what of the intrinsic issues of this bill? Let's just assume for a moment that the framework under which the GCSB operated could be perfected. Well, there are still some very significant issues. Firstly, the GCSB bill provides an override clause, as I understand it, which basically says that they can, within the framework of that bill, override all other laws and potentially this one. Secondly, I've always been concerned about two fundamental aspects of the GCSB bill. The first is that it is, under its cybersecurity provisions, allows the intercept of anything which is to do with information infrastructure, which, as I understand it, includes all transmissions, quote unquote, which could be, as we've heard, anything, including such apparently benign activities as online gaming. The other thing which John Minto has raised attention to is the issue of direct versus indirect interception on citizens. And while the GCSB bill may provide a framework, if perfected, for warranting intercepts on citizens, it hasn't, at least demonstrably to me, overcome the problem of indirect surveillance by access to a common pool of information contributed to by those who are not so constrained. And in this bill, those problems seem to have been continued, because the justification for this activity, contained in the phrase national security, is not defined in the bill. And indeed, the bill provides a discretion for the minister and the GCSB director to so define the purpose of their actions. That, I would argue, is fundamentally at odds with the idea that the primary legislation ought to specify in law the purpose and boundaries of the activity of the state. We have a problem of unintended consequence. The bill covers such a wide range of data connections, from bankings to emails to gaming, that were never previously subject to interception capability, that it is by de facto extending the previous ambit of the law in a very wholesale fashion. And there are specific problems, like the issue around encryption. The Intercept Bill requires that any material must be able to be accessed by the security services, thus containing a problem where services such as that Vikram has described with Mega are auto-encrypted and not even able to be cracked by the provider themselves. Circular logic, a backdoor intercept thereby undermines the business model, and it's a question for judgment whether the business model is thereby illegitimate or the law is illegitimate. And then there's the issue of conflict of laws. This bill, national claims, could require non-New Zealand service providers to provide data to the New Zealand government, and companies like Google and others have suggested that may contain legal problems for them where there's a clash between the New Zealand jurisdiction in which they operate and others. And then there's the Bill of Rights test, which was never put, and all the other process problems attached to this bill. No Bill of Rights vet was even sought. No GCSB evidence was provided to the hearings process. And indeed, even the private sector contributors, I'm advised, were not able to provide much detail to the hearings because that would have traversed their legal obligations to the agencies. The mitigation measures were inadequate, and we are left with a significant conundrum. What would a good government do? What would a government that cared about peace and justice and the fundamental rights of its citizens do? Would it have any such security capabilities? I'd argue that that's legitimate. Would it ever allow spying on its own citizens? Maybe once in a blue moon, under the rarest circumstances, and only with appropriate safeguards. Does this bill and its companion bill, the GCSB bill, provide those assurances? No, it most certainly does not. That is why a government that I lead would immediately set up a full and independent inquiry, would repeal the offending provisions of the GCSB Bill, and would examine very closely the intrinsic flaws in this bill to ensure that it met the standards of a good government subject to the rule of law that protected the rights and freedoms of its citizens. Kia ora tātou. Thank you very much for having us, and we look forward to being able to govern in your interests in 12 months' time. Thank you very much.
Goodness, I want to see a country led by him. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to everyone who has watched us online. John Minto will be passing around some donation buckets if you do have anything. We have cups of tea and coffee and biscuits over the side here. If you would like to stay and mix and mingle with some of the people and talk to them directly, you may do so. Thank you so much, Wellington. Thank you.
Some of you might be a wee bit rusty with the passing of the plates around the aisles, but we'll have these one for each side, and it's cost around $3,000 to put this meeting on, to fly people around and to organise the venue and the live streaming. So please give generously. We would like to carry this around through New Zealand in the lead up to the election next year. And lastly, one thing I do want to say is there is an annual protest at the Waihopai Spy Base. And next year it's on the 25th of January, and it's a Saturday afternoon. It's a lovely sunny place down in Blenheim, and if you would like to go, please think about going and joining in. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you.
Tea and coffee's over on the my right-hand side over here, so please stay and have a chat to your friends, chat to the speakers, and enjoy a cup of tea or coffee. Kia ora.